Suit riots of 1943 took place in the streets of Los Angeles, California, where many young men and women of minority groups and servicemen took to the streets, acts of violence, and created brawls amongst each other. These clashes lasted for around 5 days, where the streets were filled with violence and the use of weapons like baseball bats, blades, and more to fight each other. But these events were part of a bigger problem involving racial issues. In order to gain a better understanding of the riots' racial problems, the focus is through Mexican American and minority perspectives, including their experiences. One of the incidents connected prior to the Zoot riots is the Sleepy Lagoon case. The Sleepy Lagoon murder trial occurred in 1942. This event was prior to the riots but was a direct contributor to racial discrimination in Mexican American and minority groups. This lagoon was actually a reservoir used as a swimming pool by various Mexican youth and gangs who weren't allowed to use public pools due to the segregation of that time. On August 1st, there was a conflict between the 38th gang and Henry Leyva. He left the pool to later come back with their gang to confront their aggressors who were already gone. Later that day, there was a party where a fight broke out and the two gangs left. The next morning, the body of Jose Diaz was found near the home where this party took place. Both these gangs were seen at the party, and a trial began in order to solve the murder case. Who killed Jose Diaz? 600 Mexican Americans were gathered, leading to 22 suspects accused of murdering Diaz, some who belonged to the 38th gang, including women. During the trial, their style of clothing was pointed out and used as evidence. This trial was California's largest mass trial where Pachucos were singled out and racially profiled because of their fashion sense. On January 12, 1943, 5 out of 17 defendants were found guilty for the murder of Diaz, which led to half a year to a year in jail. 9 were found guilty and charged with second-degree murder, leading to a sentence of 5 years to life, and 3, including Henry Leyva, were found guilty and charged with first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Even with little to no evidence, members of the 38th gang and Henry were accused for murdering Jose Diaz, and the partial evidence used was their clothing style. They were targeted and trialed unfairly because of their looks, and in 1944 it was ruled that there wasn't enough evidence to pin on the young men. The Sleepy Lagoon murder sparked racial tensions and was one of the factors that led to the riots. Now, to understand the riots, we first have to understand what a Pachuco is. A Pachuco is defined differently depending on where you search for the definition, but according to a basic Google search, a Pachuco is a juvenile gang member of Mexican American ethnic origin. A Zoot suit is a man's suit of an exaggerated style, characterized by a long loose jacket with padded shoulders and high-waisted tapering trousers. Many Mexican American and minorities use these suits as their fashion style, but it was seen as something unpatriotic by Americans. The riots started on June 3, 1943, where a group of servicemen were attacked, which led to the week-long riots, where many Mexican youth were arrested. The servicemen who continued the riots would attack anyone in a Zoot suit, where they would beat and strip the person from their clothes and later be arrested. Inclusively, it is mentioned in the article Zoot Suit Riots by George Cronian that there were reports of the Mexican American youths requesting to be arrested and locked up in order to protect themselves from the servicemen in the streets. He also stated that only a few servicemen were arrested during the riots. The riots, which lasted for a week, consisted of attacks on Mexican American and any Zoot suit users. In Richard G. Del Castillo's article, Zoot Suit Riots, Mexican and Latin American Perspectives, he stated that it was not a riot by Mexican Zoot suiters, but more accurately, an attack by U.S. military personnel against young Pachucos. The conflict was between Zoot suiters and servicemen, where officials used and blamed the riots to detain and punish only Mexican and minority Zoot suit users. Servicemen were actually encouraged to go after them by officials. The message that the riots brought were a negative perspective on the Mexican people, because like Del Castillo stated, desgraciadamente esta información vino con otro mensaje que la cultura de los mexicoamericanos no era digna de honor por la supuesta gente decente, meaning that the Mexican American culture wasn't worthy or honorable to be seen as decent people. As police continued to only arrest Pachucos and the Zoot suiters, the Mexican government was struggling to form a response since they were allied with the U.S. One of the issues was because of the possibility of Mexican Americans not being categorized or fully accepted from one place. This was a part of the whole ni de aquí ni de allá issue regarding the question of whether they are from here or from there. So were they considered Mexican or American? Because they weren't Mexican enough to be Mexicans and they weren't American enough to be American. Race was a clear indicator of why the riots occurred. Discrimination can be seen from the difference in the number of how many people were arrested between Mexican Americans, and minorities compared to the servicemen. Although this was already a racial issue, on June 7th, which was the worst day of rioting, many servicemen and citizens attacked Zoot suiters and minority group members who were not wearing Zoot suits. The very next day, military officials made Los Angeles an off-limit place for the sailors and soldiers. This also led to military police patrolling the city because local police couldn't contain the situation and weren't being fair. Because of the events, by the time the riots ended, Zoot suits were banned from being worn in the streets of Los Angeles. Although this was the end of the LA Zoot suit riots, there was still racial problems. It also sparked other cities and states to be disturbed for racial injustices made toward minority groups. There were incidents of race riots in places like Detroit and others. The Detroit, Michigan riot from 1943 was a racially motivated brawl which resulted in 34 deaths, 1,800 arrests, and many injuries. Civil disobedience continued to disturb the streets in many places. In Zoot suit culture, many youths who wore these suits were often stereotyped to be gang-related and delinquents, but in reality their culture consisted of challenging assimilation into Mexican and American cultures. Douglas Henry Daniels' article on Race Riot, Tapachuco, and the black music culture, he stated that for these youth, music, the suit, and the dance, all embraced with such seriousness, expressed not only belonging to a group, but an affirmation of self. Zoot suit culture was seen and expanded throughout the states and other countries. Zoot suits were seen in places like London, where people engaged in similar activities like dancing, attending ballrooms, and expressing themselves through fashion. The Zoot culture and Zoot suit users expanded further out into the US, showing that they weren't all gang affiliated or troublemakers like how they were portrayed. Just because they wore these baggy suits, it didn't make them criminals. It was just a fashion depiction of self-identity and challenging norms. There are headlines like Angered US Sailors Mob Zoot Suit Gangs, where even though it talks about the sailors doing the mobbing, the focus turns to the end of the headline because of assumptions that everyone who wears a zoot suit is part of a gang. We also have headlines like New Pachuco, Attack Reported, or Mexican Youth Gang Wars Flare, which arguably all create a negative view on Mexican youth and Pachucos because they are associated to gang relations and starting fights. They are being portrayed as a problem, and since these newspapers are providing this information and are supposed to be trusted sources, they were able to manipulate the public in favor of the American people. Some of the experiences that will be discussed in the next segment include how the media was able to manipulate news. Now, the experience of Mexican and Mexican Americans during the riots all have something in common. They were being racially targeted and discriminated, which led to negative outcomes and unfair treatment. One of the many experiences of being racially targeted or being treated unfairly was the incident with Ms. Venegas. In Elizabeth Escobedo's article on the Pachucas Panic, she provides Amelia Venegas' experience with zoot suiters and police. Escobedo states that Amelia and her baby witnessed police officers harassing a group of zoot suiters, and she felt a sense of injustice. Unable to contain her emotions, the Mexican-American woman cursed the law enforcement officials for their hostile treatment of the young men. The officers immediately arrested her for disturbing the peace, and because she carried brass knuckles just in case of being attacked, because of the riots going on, she was charged for carrying a concealed weapon. So what does the media have to do with this? Well, like Escobedo stated, Venegas had never been involved in criminal activity, yet the Los Angeles Times featured a photograph of her baring teeth and shaking a threatening fist at the camera. The press not only deemed Venegas as a Pachuco girl, a label suggesting gang affiliation, but her protest on behalf of Zoot suitors, a much despised youth population, also made her a perfect target for a sensationalist media campaign. With her photograph being published, it was easy to stereotype and portray someone in any way, like in her case, where they painted her as something she really wasn't. The media had complete control of how to write and create a new fake story. The next Zoot experience occurred on June 7, 1943, involving Vicente Morales. In Luis Alvarez's book, The Power of the Zoot, Youth Culture and Resistance During World War II, he provides Morales' experience. As a young Mexican-American teenager who wanted to dance to jazz music, he was attacked by servicemen without a motive. Like Alvarez states in his book, a group of white sailors, without provocation, began shoving him and screaming obscenity-laced insults. Vicente remembers waking up to cracked ribs, broken nose, black and blue all over from being beat. After being stripped by the servicemen, Morales was handcuffed by Los Angeles police, arrested on charges of disturbing the peace, and transported by paddy wagon to a city jail. Even though Morales was clearly attacked, without doing anything and getting beat, he was the one being taken to jail. The Los Angeles Zoot riots of 1943 are an essential part of history, where we are exposed to different racial tensions between groups. We are able to see the difference in treatment between Mexican Americans and minority groups compared to whites. There is much discrimination and segregation seen, like in the Sleepy Lagoon murder, or the arrests during the riots, and through the experiences of Pachucos and Mexican Americans. We were able to see how the media also affects these issues and how much of an influential role they can play. Overall, these Zoot users provide a glimpse into the racial problems in the U.S. This documentary on the Zoot riots was made for Dr. Slaughter's Digital Research 4496 class on Race, Ethnicity, Community, and Nation at Cal Poly Pomona.